করলেন?
আপনি co-host, হ্যাঁ আপনি co-host হয়ে আছেন। না ঠিক আছে, অসুবিধা কিছু নেই।
ওটা কাউকে অন্য কাউকে করলে ভালো হয় আর কি। আমি দুটো দিকে করতে পারবো না।
No problem. আচ্ছা, we can start off whenever all of you are ready. It's almost time now.
আচ্ছা, আমার তো শোনা যাচ্ছে আমার কথাটা?
Yes ma'am.
এখন শুরু করব বলিস?
অমৃতা,
হ্যাঁ বলুন ম্যাডাম।
তুমি যদি কমফোর্টেবল না হও তাহলে আকাশ বাবুকে বলো অন্য কাউকে
কাউকে হোস্ট করে না, আমাকে একটা অন্য কাজ দিয়েছেন তো।
অমৃতা খুব কনফিডেন্ট নয়, সেক্ষেত্রে আপনি অন্য কাউকে বলুন, দ্যাট উইল বি ইজিয়ার। দেখুন
It's not really necessary. It's really not necessary. So we could start off.
If it is not necessary, then it's okay though.
Yeah, we can start off the webinar whenever.
So we can শুরু করব এখন।
অনুসুয়াদি, প্রিন্সিপাল ম্যাডামকে করে শুরু করো, 5:02 বাজে তো।
ঠিক আছে। Good evening to all. Today, the Department of History, Bethune College, in collaboration with IQAC Bethune College, has organized a webinar titled Concerns of Historians and Journalists on Pandemic, Past and Present. Now, before the inauguration of the session, I would like to draw the attention of the participants on some important points. Please note that after the speakers have finished their speech, there will be a question and answer session. Participants are requested to write their queries in the chat box only, and it will be available almost at the end of the second speaker's presentation. And the link for the feedback forms shall be provided to the participants. It will also be provided in YouTube chat. So please fill up the forms carefully and completely, on the basis of which individual certificates will be provided to you. And the most important thing is that mute your microphone and switch off your video to enjoy the session. Do not write unnecessary messages in the chat box. Now I requested our respected principal, Madam Dr. Krishna Roy, to inaugurate and to deliver the welcome speech. So over to Principal, Madam.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are.
So, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to address this special webinar entitled Concerns of Historians and Journalists on Pandemic, Past and Present. We have already heard that this webinar has been arranged by Department of History in collaboration with Internal Quality Assurance Cell of Bethune College. So on behalf of Bethune College, I welcome all the participants, that is students, faculty members of our college, other institutions, our alumni, and other interested listeners. And I cordially welcome our speakers of today, Dr. Shati Bhattacharya, Senior Assistant Editor, Journalist, Author, and Researcher, and writer of several books. Personally, I am an avid reader of her writings. And I also welcome Dr. Shobhasachী Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor, Department of History, Polanyi University. You know, Bethune College has already arranged for a number of webinars during this lockdown period, and many of the webinars are dedicated to the etiology of the disease as well as the medical measures, how to combat with this disease, how to maintain social distance, the socio-economic effect of this lockdown period, and many other things. But what I consider this webinar is a special kind of lens through which we can see the history of pandemic as well as pandemic of today. We are all fighting against an invisible organism. But the problem is uh, we are we are not sure when the pandemic will be over. But our old experience has taught us that this is not a new one. The world has witnessed several pandemics in its long history. For every biology student, there is a common term, biological outbreak, which means sudden increase in occurrence of a disease in a particular time and in a particular place. It may affect a small localized area, then it is known as endemic. If it has impact upon a bigger area affecting larger people, it becomes epidemic. And if it affects globally, then it becomes pandemic. The word pandemic has its root from Greek words pan meaning all and demos, people. We usually or incorrectly use this pandemic, the word pandemic, in several situations. Nowadays, I find a particular term in Bengali, otimari, which is not common, which I have never heard before. But what we have heard, that is Mohamari or Moro, and all these things. If we go through the Bengali literature during Rabindranath, time of Rabindranath, Sharat Chandra, or Bankim Chandra, we have heard about Ola Otha, that is cholera, or plague, or Boshanto, that is smallpox, all these things. So this pandemic, this occurrence of pandemic was in our country as well as in other countries. And if we go through the history of pandemic, world pandemics, pandemic means it affects the world. We can have the data of three important pandemics in the last 3 or 4 centuries. The first one I can say, the Great Bubonic Plague of Marseille in from 1720 to 23. That means it lasted for 4 years, and many people died in this situation. The second one, which affected our country, especially Calcutta also, first cholera pandemic, which is also known as Asiatic Cholera, and it lasted from 1817 to 1824, so almost 7 years. And then in the 1918 to 1920, that was famous Spanish flu, which often we compare with this COVID-19 with Spanish flu all the time. And we also come across another term, that is quarantine. And this is very loosely used. That means quarantine is for 14 days. Those who are from biology, they know that quarantine, some diseases are considered as quarantine disease, and for which quarantine leave is admitted. And this is for 14 years. But initially or originally, the period quarantine lasted for 40 days, and it began in 14th century, especially to control plague. And the sheep were allowed to stay in isolated area uh, far beyond the coastal area, so that the coastal cities are not affected, and the sheep were allowed to stay there for about 40 days. So this is the basic of pandemic and the term quarantine. And there are many other small epidemics in the last century, and we can remember Asian flu of 1957, which was due to influenza virus, then Hong Kong flu, 1968, then HIV and AIDS, which is, though these are considered as manageable and chronic disease, then SARS 2002, then swine flu 2009, then MERS 2012, Ebola outbreak 2014. So all these epidemic and an endemic, pandemic are going side by side, and we have to endure all these problems. If we survive, we will enter into a new world. So each pandemic has taught the civilization a new technology, meaning of new life. So much so, we are having with us two very distinguished speakers, and we will be enlightened with their speech. And I hope everybody will enjoy today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Quarantine and lockdown are actually two key terms that shape our existence today around the world. They signify a halt on all regular activities, especially our essential need to socialize as humans. In this moment of crisis, people have been faced with a challenging question: preservation of human life or economic stability. Which of the two is more important in our modern society? Different segments of society, from industrialists, businessmen, to daily wage earners and migrant laborers, are reacting from varied perspectives. The world media has been flooding us with latest informations, guidelines, comments, and harrowing first-hand accounts of medical staff and first responders who are constantly risking their lives and trying their utmost, even with the lack of appropriate infrastructure and administrative guidance. The administration has failed to empathize with the plight of the common man during this pandemic, and the sense of helplessness and anguish in the face of this crisis has been insurmountable. Human beings all over the world have been caught up in a labyrinth of accurate and false news popping up daily on social media. Overwhelming as it may be, people still have little pockets of hope for a better future. However, a pandemic is not new to us. Over this long period of human existence, diseases have wreaked havoc in society. Even some 5,000 years ago, when a prehistoric village in China first recorded an pandemic. In recent years, we have also lived through Ebola, swine flu, and now COVID-19. Thus, we shall continue to remind ourselves that a pandemic is not just defined by incidents of crisis and destruction, but also by recovery and rejuvenation. Now, today our esteemed speakers, Dr. Shobbosati Chattopadhyay and Dr. Swati Bhattacharjee, are going to enrich us with their knowledge on the history of pandemics in the light of the present perspective and to look at it through the eyes of media. Our first speaker in the session is the eminent scholar and historian, Dr. Shobbosati Chattopadhyay from the University of Kalyani, who specialized in the history of science, technology, environment, and medicine. Presently, he's working on historiography of STEM and history of secular scientific culture of Indian subcontinent. He shall speak on contemporary concerns on past pandemics. Now over to Dr. Chattopadhyay.
At the very beginning, I would like to thank the authorities of Bethune College for inviting me to speak in this webinar. The title of the webinar, as you have already mentioned, that concerns of historians and journalists on the pandemic, past and present. Now, I am a practicing historian in the sense that I teach history, but I doubt whether I am eligible enough to represent the historian's camp. I am a teacher of history and I do humble research on the history of science, technology, environment, and medicine. My area of study is mainly contemporary history. However, the present pandemic situation has compelled me, like most of you, as Honorable Principal and the Head of the Department of History has already mentioned that the present situation in which we are living. So we are compelled to trace the history of the pandemic. Thus, what I would like to speak on the historical outline of the past, as I have been requested by the organizers. Now, these are mere facts, some of which has already been mentioned by the Honorable Principal, ma'am. If the views is concerned, I think I have to highlight the history of last 4 or 5 months. The students of history must know that all major events have both immediate and far-reaching effect on history. And the pandemic caused by COVID-19 is not an exceptional one. However, in this webinar, we have a renowned scribe who will speak on the contemporary history and its multidimensionality in her presentation titled Covering COVID. Thus, I would like to confine myself in the past, that is the past pandemics. Now, before starting, what I would like to say that I'd be happy if I would present this lecture in front of the physical audience in an auditorium of Bethune College, but that is not possible in this situation. And at the very beginning, I would like to record my connection with Bethune College. After receiving the invitation, I visited the website of the college and I found that most of the present faculty members were the students of Jadavpur University, but I also a student from my undergraduate level to doctoral research. And another thing I would like to put on record that one of the alumni of Bethune College, a prominent alumni of the Department of History, is now working for his research, for her research, I may mention, under my supervision. She is Shreya Rai, who stood first both undergraduate and postgraduate level at the University of Calcutta. Now, after these initial words, I would like to start my presentation. Let's start to focus on the history, that is the past pandemics. Now, I have been requested that I should be bilingual. So, I would like to speak some on Bangla and some on English. For the first time, I would like to speak on past pandemics. Now, we are concerned about the past pandemics because of the present happening. All of us know. The first question which comes to our mind, whether there was any kind of situation in the past. As the principal has mentioned, that there were a number of pandemics or epidemics. She has mentioned the terms in Bangla, Utimari and Mohamari Moru. The students of history honors have to study the history of the 14th century Europe. Know about the 14th century Black Death. I start with the happenings of the 14th century Europe because the word quarantine is related to the 14th century Black Death. But the outbreak of this plague, this epidemic in the 14th century must be situated in the terms like pandemic and epidemic. Now, as the principals mentioned that epidemic means a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time and space. It refers to a sudden increase in the number of cases of a disease above what is normally expected. We can see a number of epidemics in history, as I have mentioned. Among those, the mention must be made of the Black Death of the 14th century. It was in the period between 1346 and 48. The epidemic spread over Italy due to plague. Approximately 25 million people died out of approximately 80 million total population in Europe. The custom of quarantine was started from that time. Now, how did the germ originate then? Is there any definite answer? You would be astonished to know that, like contemporary days, the allegation was made against China. Sefket Pamuk, in his paper, The Black Death and the Origins of the Great Divergence Across Europe, 1300 to 1600, that was published in European Review of Economic History, published by Cambridge University Press in 2007, opined that, I quote, it began to appear in China during 1330s and reached the Crimea in 1346. From the China, the Pasturella pestis and the plague took ship and traveled to Constantinople and Sicily in the year 1347, Egypt and Syria in 1348, and spread to the rest of Europe in the following years. So that was the story of the Black Death that spread over a long, vast area of Europe, and not only Europe, it was not confined within the Europe. And as I have mentioned, that it started from China. That some pictures has been shown in the presentation. These are the pictures of the 14th century. It's the triumph of death. Now, as I mentioned, the term quarantine is associated with the epidemic of the 14th century. And here we can see the picture of the famous Venice, a port in Italy. This quarantine, as already it has been mentioned, that quarantine is a state, period, or place of isolation in which people or animals that have arrived from elsewhere or been exposed to infectious or contagious diseases are placed. The strict isolation imposed to prevent the spread of disease. The period of quarantine was originally of 40 days. Its history also lies in 14th century Italy. Quarantine derived from the word quaranta, that means 40, and the ships were not allowed to enter the Italian port, Venice, for 40 days to prevent the spread of the germ of plague in the 14th century. That was the port of Venice. And that is the first sketch of the port of Venice that has been found some years back. It was pencil sketch of the Venice port. The detention imposed upon ships has now been replaced by isolation imposed upon persons on arrival at a port or place when suspected of carrying some infectious or contagious disease. That the term quarantine has changed. That is also the scenario of Italy. I am talking about the 14th century Italy. But the outbreak of plague has more ancient history. The students of history must know that in the ancient period, before starting the ancient Greece, I would like to mention that in Malta, we have the history that quarantine was lasted for less than 40 days. It was for 18 days. That is a picture of Malta. Now, coming from the 14th century, I would like to focus on ancient Greece. As I mentioned, the history of pandemic must be traced in the history of ancient Greece. The students of Greek history are acquainted with the names of two great ancient historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. In this slide, we are viewing the picture of Thucydides, who wrote the famous book, The History of the Peloponnesian War. That book was on the history of the war between Athens and Sparta. Thucydides wrote the history of Peloponnesian War, where he had mentioned the outbreak of plague. The plague that took place in Athens in the 5th century BC. So, what we can mention that in the period before Christ, in the Greek history, we find the presence of this kind of epidemic. So, the history of epidemic must be traced in the ancient Greek society. As I have been requested to speak on the history of epidemic, I would like to give an outline of the history. Thus, I would like to jump from this 14th century to ancient Greece, and then I would like to focus on the 19th century. That is the development of Sanitary Conference in the 19th century. In 1851, the first International Sanitary Conference was held in Paris. That conference was first of its kind because at that time there was going concern that a number of factors are responsible for the outbreak of a disease, and the students of history must know that in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution took place in England and then in the continent. Thus, we find the development of urbanization, which resulted the development or the emergence of a new kind of urban setting. And some diseases became evident because of these, what we can say, precocious urbanization. That urbanization lacked the proper development, and what we noticed that the concerned people, they felt the necessity to focus on the improvement of sanitary condition. In England, emphasis was made on the development of the sanitary condition, and in this background, the first International Sanitary Conference was convened in Paris. As I mentioned, that was first of its kind. The objective of this conference was very limited. What was the objective? The objective was to introduce some order and uniformity into quarantine measures, which varied from country to country earlier. That first conference, it lasted for 6 months with no lasting results. Some members opposed quarantine and some took an intermediate position. That was the history of the first International Sanitary Conference. Now, if we study the proceedings of International Sanitary Conference, that is the first conference, and if we study the proceedings of the conferences, those were held between 1851 and 1938, we find a number of striking point. I would like to show you some pictures, and I would like to focus on the third conference that was mainly named as the Cholera Conference. Now, census made in 1831 showed that the inhabitants of Paris numbered 785862. On 26 March 1832, cholera struck the city for the first time in its history. Infection having come from England, in April 1832, alone there were 12,733 deaths from cholera in Paris. This was more than half the average annual number of deaths. As I have already mentioned, that when epidemic comes, the average death increases. Thus, there were 12,733 deaths from cholera in Paris. This was more than half the average annual number of deaths from all causes for the previous 10 years. And an intolerable strain was placed upon public services. There was a penury not only of grave diggers but also of transport to take the dead to the burial grounds. Just think of the present situation. Our municipal corporation, they are saying that they don't have enough resources to move the dead body from houses or hospitals. The situation was same in 19th century Paris. An attempt was made to remedy the latter deficiency by placing military wagons into service, but this solution had to be abandoned for two reasons. The vehicles were unsprung, and the noise that they made at night in the cobbled streets of the city deprived all the inhabitants of sleep and added to the reigning atmosphere of terror. The sound was so heavy that the common people, they could not sleep in the sound, in that noise. Moreover, the vibration was such that the coffins disintegrated and foul fluids escaped from the corpses. This experiment was abandoned after only one day. The epidemic ended in September, having claimed a total of 18,402 victims. Thanks to cholera, deaths in Paris in 1832 jumped from an expected 23,000 to 44,000. In this drawing by a famous artist, Vermeer, the man, please look at the slide, the man in the foreground has collapsed in the street. Just compare with the present situation. The man collapsed in the street from cholera. In the background, two men are carrying a coffin while a hearse drives by bearing another. On the left, a terrified woman rushes into the house. Just compare with the present situation. While on the right, even the dog has its tail between its legs. That is the story of the picture. Now I would like to show another picture. 1 year after the first International Sanitary Conference, that is, I have already mentioned the conference was held in 1851, so it is the story of 1852. The Punch, the famous satirical magazine, published this cartoon entitled "A Court for King Cholera." Britain had then suffered from two disastrous waves of the disease and was to have two more. While that's a slide. This is this slide. While the nature of the cholera, as of other diseases, remained an enigma, there was general recognition that insanitary conditions predisposed to disease. The title of the cartoon is a pun for the course were small rectangular open spaces bounded by the slum dwellings in which inhabitants lived in conditions of unimaginable squalor and overcrowding. Such conditions provided the ideal soil for the spread of cholera. It was the picture of 1852, as of other communicable diseases. Unhappily, comparable conditions still exist in some countries, and it is only in these that cholera continues to constitute a menace. The elucidation of the etiology, cholera did little or nothing to aid in its prevention, for it had been recognized long before, if for the wrong reasons, that the surest shield against the disease was a pure supply of piped water and sanitary disposal of human waste. Uh, Now I would like to show another picture. In 1855, Michael Faraday, the great English scientist whose name is immortalized in that of International Unit of Electrical Capacity, as all of us know, he sent a letter to the Times protesting against the appalling pollution of the River Thames. Its water, said Faraday, was of an opaque pale brown color, and the piece of white card that he had thrown into it became invisible at a very small degree of submersion. Punch, the English satirical weekly, as I have already mentioned, founded in 1841 and originally modeled on the French Sanitary, represented Faraday's simple experiment in graphic form in this cartoon published on 21st July 1855. At the same time, expressing the hope that Faraday's epistle would help to avert cholera. It was in the same year that John Snow published the second edition of On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, the importance of which was generally overlooked in his own and in other countries. Although it is now recognized as a classic of valid epidemiological reasoning. While England was the birthplace of environmental sanitation, as I have mentioned that England was also the birthplace of industrial revolution, resulted it was also the birthplace of environmental sanitation. The English sanitarians obstinately refused to believe for many years the simple truths that Snow's investigations had revealed. Nevertheless, they were firmly convinced that the provision of pure water supplies and sanitary disposal of human waste contributed in some undefinable way to health. Immense sums of money were spent on sanitary improvements, with the result that the British Isle became free from cholera epidemics some 3 decades before other Western European countries. Uh, Now, I would like to show another picture. I have already shown this picture. Now, what I would like to mention that in 1866, the third international conference on sanitation was held. It was held at Constantinople. These conference was very important. Why it was important? Because apart from the anomalous 1881 conference in Washington, it was the only one not to be held in Western Europe. It was by far the longest in duration of these conferences. The third conference started on 13th February 1866 and it ended on 26th September. Its printed proceedings, we are viewing the proceedings, its printed proceedings, which run to 1,130 pages, are very rare, and according to a standard reference work on international conference proceedings, the only copy located in the whole of North America is in the University of Michigan. The cholera had hitherto spread slowly by land from India. Please listen. The cholera had hitherto spread slowly by land from India across Asian steppes to southern Russia and then to the rest of Europe. But in 1865, it was conveyed by sea from Egypt to Mediterranean ports in Europe, whence it spread. It was this new outbreak that prompted the convening of the Constitutional Conference. As with the two preceding and three succeeding conferences, no international treaty resulted. After discussions lasting for over 7 months, as I have already mentioned, delegates returned to their countries by the slow means. As you know, at that time, the mode of communication was not of the present times. So they returned their countries by the slow means that available. And what so they returned their countries. What I have been saying that agreeing on certain points, but they disagreed on others. Cholera had been the sole subject of discussion at this conference. But while all delegates were ignorant of its causes, any hope of international agreement remained illusory. The contrast between this conference, only just over a century ago, and the annual meetings of the World Health Assembly could hardly be more striking. The assembly lasts for just another 3 weeks, and delegates from almost 140 countries come by jet plane nowadays. Decide on a worldwide program and its budget, and are soon back again at their normal occupations. So that is the difference between the past and the present. So what I would like to mention, the relevance of this third conference on the sanitation, especially its impact on India. In the third conference, we find that allegations was made against India for spreading the germ of cholera. There was a cholera epidemic in Europe in the previous year, that is in 1865. The Sanitary Conference was organized to address that problem in particular. I have already mentioned that the 66th conference is also known as Cholera Conference. It was said that the pilgrimage and religious prayers in British India were responsible for the spread of the germ that was cholera. But at that time, the British ruler was, however, not in a position to take any stringent action against religious customs, as it had to face the wrath of the people just a decade earlier during the revolt of 1857. It was said the interference of the British ruler in the religious matter of the Indians was one of the causes of the revolt of 1857. And showing the 1857 pictures, the postage stamp. So ultimately, the Britishers did not interfere in the Indian affairs, religious affairs in that period. But ultimately, the British ruler had to enact the act. And it was because of the occurrence of plague in 1890s. All of us know that in 1890s, mainly 1895-96, a plague took place in Bombay. There was that was an epidemic, and in that epidemic, we find a number of Indian people fought against, and they tried to prevent that epidemic. Here, we are viewing Savitribai Phule fought against this epidemic plague. After the occurrence of this epidemic of 1895-96, the British ruler had to enact the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897. That was the first act for controlling epidemics in India. That was an act to provide for the better prevention of the spread of dangerous epidemic diseases. The act provides power to exercise for the control and to prevent any epidemic or spread of epidemic in the states of country. So in the present situation, we're also hearing the this particular act, and this particular act has been used to combat this COVID-19 also. Now, through this act, the states were authorized, and the officers or the agencies of the state were authorized to take particular measures if the state feel that the public at large is threatened with an outbreak of any dangerous epidemic, or what we can say the pandemic in the present situation. Any person disobeying the regulation or order made under this act shall be deemed to have committed an offence punishable under section 188 of the IPC, that is Indian Penal Code. So that was the first act in India which was enacted to prevent epidemic or to get rid of this epidemic. This act was made by British India. Now, in the 20th century, we find the outbreak of polio in USA, in New York. And there, we also heard of some kind of quarantine. The people were instructed not to go outside their own home. The public places were closed. The cinema halls were closed, and the people were prohibited to enter any public places. That was the story of New York in the year 1916. After that, we find the outbreak of Spanish flu, as Honorable Principal has mentioned. It it was held in 1918 onwards, and we can say that for the first time, this can now, can you see the slide? Yes. Now, is it okay?
Yes, it's back. Thank you.
Yes. So I lost my network.
Yeah.
International health regulations that was published by World Health Organization in the year 2005. Now, presently, we are following these regulations. So, in India, when we are talking of the present pandemic, we are talking of the past precedents along with these two important act and regulations. The first act, as I have mentioned already, the Epidemic Diseases Act 1897, and the second is the International Health Regulations that was passed in 2005. So we are mainly referring these two acts and regulations for preventing this present pandemic situation. Now we are going through a new age. This age, we are uh, talking of the social distancing, and social distancing means we are not shaking hands with others. Rather, we would like to say namaskar by folding our hands. Now, there are some misconceptions. Loosely, people are talking of coronavirus as responsible for the present situation. But truly speaking, coronavirus is a common one. It is the second important virus which is responsible for our common cough and cold. The first important virus is the rhinovirus. Now, it is the COVID-19 which is our contemporary concern. I think uh, Shakidi will talk on the present situation, the contemporary concern, and I would love to say a few words on the contemporary history, the history of the last 4 or 5 months, which taught us a lot. Now, we are always talking of that history repeats and history teaches us through its past happenings. So we are learning a lot during the last 5 or 6 months, last 4 or 5 months. But I would like to confine myself, as I have mentioned in the introductory point, that I just tried I just tried to make an outline of the past epidemics and pandemics. So the present situation will be covered by Shatidi. What I would like to say that is a COVID-19, which is our contemporary concern, and it's a unique one. It has been identified as a novel coronavirus. So we are fighting it in our own way, and we are fighting with the help of others. So uh, in the concluding words, we must thank not only the listener of this presentation, but I would like to end my talk by thanking the doctor, the nurse, the health worker, the sweeper, the police for protecting us from COVID-19. So I think uh, I have made an presentation of the past pandemics in a outline in a jump it way, but if you have follow the presentation, you should have some idea of the past pandemics. Now I would like to end by thanking you all for listening this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shobhashati Chattopadhyay, for such an illustrative and detailed presentation on the history of pandemics. Now, our second speaker is the eminent writer and journalist, Dr. Swati Bhattacharjee. The focus of his work is on socio-economic development, poverty elevation, differential treatment of women, problems of the farmers, and the use of media in democracy. Mention must be made of her NBER working paper with the Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee. Today, Dr. Bhattacharjee's topic of discussion is covering COVID, a journalist's note on a pandemic. Now over to the speaker.
Thank you so much, Professor Anushya Datta. Thanks for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts with all of you. Many of you must be wondering, as I'm wondering myself, that what is a journalist doing in a conference on history? Because of course, media has to do only with the latest, right? We are concerned with what is happening now, what is happening today, what is happening right at this moment. So, what is this dwelling on the past that has to do with the person who is working on news? The reason why every media person has to take new history into account is that history doesn't only give us information, it also gives us meaning. History is a receptacle of people's experiences. It tells us about the choices that people had to face in the past, choices that are very similar to the choices that we are making today. And what were the challenges before them? And what were the choices that they actually made and why? And what were the consequences of those choices and who suffered the most for the choices that were made at that time by the people who had the power to make choices. These are the questions that must constantly inform the choices that we make today. And believe me, the dilemmas are very much the similar, very, very alike. We face the same moral and political uh, problems that we had faced many years ago. So while I was looking at the kind of policy choices that we had to make here in Bengal, I found a very sort of interesting fact that, this time the pandemic has come to us from China. But in 1840, it was Calcutta which sent the disease to China, the cholera. We were listening to Professor Chattopadhyay and what he had to say about the spread of diseases from China to others in a much earlier time. But in 1840, from Calcutta to China, the cholera spread, and then from China to Central Asia to Persia, finally to Russia, where it killed 1 million people, and then to the countries of Western Europe. Now, it was not this one time. We find that cholera became an epidemic in Bengal in early 19th century, from 1817 onwards. There were repeated outbreaks of cholera. And in India or in the larger world, every time there was a cholera epidemic, it is noted that it almost always started from Bengal. So Bengal was the epicenter. It was the endemic region for cholera. Why? The reason for it is attributed to the insanitary conditions, chiefly in the city of Calcutta. I'm reading from a book on epidemics. The following description of the living conditions of Calcutta hold true for other cities and towns. What is the description? A basti, a native village, generally consists of a mass of huts constructed without any plan or arrangement, without roads, without drains, ill ventilated, and never cleaned. Most of the villages and towns are the abodes of misery, vice, and filth, and the nurseries of sickness and disease. So, this was well recognized as far back as the early and the middle of the 19th century. And today, in the 21st century, after the outbreak of the COVID, in a very recent briefing, the UN has said that 90% of COVID infection is happening in the urban areas. 90% of all who are affected by the COVID are citizens of our cities. This shows the horrible condition of many of the cities, not only in the developing world, mind you. Of course, this is true very much of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, cities of Sub-Saharan Africa, but even in Hong Kong, where one of the places where the COVID raged very early, it has been found that bad housing was one of the main reasons for the spread of the disease. So it is very clear from the very beginning, as Professor Chattopadhyay was showing us repeatedly, there had been so many starting, I mean, 1857, they were already having the third sanitation conference. So they were having many conferences, and there were never any dearth of unanimity on the question on what are the things that have to be done to free the city of epidemics. For example, Ronald Ross, who you know had sat in Calcutta to find his famous identification of the reason for malaria, how malaria is actually transmitted to humans. He found it. And he had given very detailed descriptions of directions on what is to be done to free a city from malaria. He got the Nobel in 1902. He died about 20 years later. In between, he had many awards, and he had earned much. He was given a whole lot of honors, but he lamented that I am given all sorts of awards and honors, but the basic things that I had said are completely ignored. So look at the choices that we made then, and look at the choices that we are making now, which there has never been any doubt that our cities are unsafe. Our cities, and especially the bastis, the slums, the areas where the poorest people, the working people, people who live by the sweat of their brow, they are the most vulnerable because they're forced to live in the worst possible conditions. Studies have found that the Delhi slums, they amplify flu epidemics several times. In Mumbai, in Dharavi, the studies have shown that there are less deaths. Why? Not because there are less infections, but because there were more infections. They have all been infected, and now they have developed antibodies. So now they are partially immune. Imagine what might have happened if they had not developed antibodies. If this is if a different kind of some mutated virus comes to which the human body is not so easily amenable, what kind of deaths may happen then? So these are very important political questions, that who do you privilege over others? For what do you spend your resources? And who controls housing? Let us look around us and let us look at the rest of the world. Lockdowns happened almost everywhere, barring a few countries like South Korea and some Scandinavian countries. Every countries went through phases of lockdown. But it was only in India that the poor laborers were out marching in the roads by thousands. They were walking for days on end, thousands of kilometers to get home. Why did they have to leave? They had to leave because they stay in awful conditions where they pay exorbitant prices. This is what Nirmala Banerjee, one of the most renowned economists, were telling me the other day. She will be writing on this very soon. But it is, you know, we have created in urban areas a situation which is not only extremely unhealthy, but also at the same time extremely exploitative. They have no amenities at all. In the Bengal lamp Basti area in Jadavpur, some of the my friends who are now working as members of the Jadavpur commune, and they distribute free food. And they were telling me that when we go into these areas, we find that for 400 uh, houses, if you can call them houses, 400 living places, there are only two sources of drinking water. So, in such a situation, can you expect proper sanitation? Can you expect proper drinking water? Can you expect a life free of infections? There has been another very interesting study on 7 cities of Kolkata trying to calculate, how much a family has to pay if they are to access the pay and use toilets. The slum dwellers, how much would they pay? Because they don't have individual houses, right? And we are having this Swachh Bharat where we cannot have open defecation. So everybody has to use a toilet, but where are those toilets? And it was calculated that a family of 5 would have to pay rupees 48 a day in Kolkata if they wanted to use only toilets. So naturally, they try to avoid it as much as they can. So each of these things which we ignore completely, which are never ever considered when we do urban planning, these are the seeds of epidemic. This is how epidemics start. This is why how epidemics become uncontrollable. So these are some of the most important things that we have to keep in mind, the important choices. So here what we find is that history is giving us a clue, even to journalists, even those of us who are here now, who are looking at the indescribable, perhaps we have never before seen this scale of suffering, as Professor Datta was saying in her introductory remarks, that the amount of hardship that we see because of loss of life and loss of livelihood is unprecedented. So, what we could do is to go beyond this obsession with how many people are dying, how many was it yesterday, how many is it today, how many people are going without masks, how many people have the police beaten up. Those are the questions that um, finally do not hold much meaning. The really meaningful question, if you want me to go under the skin of the problem, if we have to go beneath the surface of the problem, then we have to ask, why are our cities unsafe? And this is where you, as students and researchers of history, could really brief us, could really empower the media by giving us the kind of policy decisions historically that our administrators have made that made our cities unsafe, both before independence and after independence. For example, we had all these wonderful things about smart city, these brilliant ideas, and before that, the JNNURM, the Urban Renewal Mission. What happened to those? How did they address the problems of the urban poor? What did we have to do to give better housing, better sanitation, better uh, amenities so that they are not forced to become both careers, sufferers of disease, victims of disease, and also carriers of disease. Look how social injustice works, that first we force them to be exposed to the disease, and then we shun them, we stop them at the borders of the state as if they are not citizens, as if they have no rights to return their own homes, because we say that they are vectors. We treat them like vectors, like rats or like mosquitoes or cockroaches. This is how we treat our own fellow citizens. And we do this because of our own faulty policies. We have to question those policies, we have to question those decisions. And that is why we need to know why we made those wrong choices, what forced us, who were we privileging, who were making those decisions, and why. A second fact I wish to uh, highlight today. This is again, if the first part of my talk today was on what we tend to overlook, the second part is on what we tend to underplay. And here I will turn to a part of history that is not epidemics. It is in fact famine. You all remember the famine. And I was reading a very interesting piece it's a very interesting book. I'm sure many of you have read it. It's called Hungry Bengal by Janam Mukherjee, who teaches history in Canada. So he was saying how, according to him, it was media which actually made that crisis a famine. So what happened was that Ian Stephens, who was the chief editor of the Statesman, he could see how people were rushing to Kolkata from the outskirts, from the villages, and they were just dying in the cities of Kolkata because of starvation. This was 1943. But the rules at that time, the rules passed, that was an emergency time because of the war. And the British had actually said, it's unbelievable, but this is what happened, that the emergency law said that no direct reference to the word famine can be made. It was prohibited. You could not write the word famine. So, uh, naturally, you see that the government was um, completely in denial. It refused to acknowledge that a famine was actually raging in the villages of Bengal. So this law did not say anything directly about photographs. It did not prohibit photographs. So what Ian Stephens did was that in a single afternoon, a crew of photographers were sent out by Stephens, and they collected a shocking dossier of famine pictures, some so horrifying that the editor himself found them utterly unpublishable. Those that were a little less appalling were run in a photo spread, published in the Sunday edition of The Statesman on August 22nd, 1943. And in some definite sense, the event ever since known as the Bengal famine of 1943 had been born. So you see, there was a tremendous crisis of loss of life and livelihood that was happening. And of course, as we all know, that famine never comes by itself. It is always followed by epidemics. And that too happened here in Bengal, and more lives perhaps were lost. Actually, the government always wrote off the deaths as deaths due to various diseases. They were very loath to accept starvation as a cause of death. But you see here the role of media, that statesman, that one paper, that one editor, he had the courage to actually publish those photographs. And even as he did so, and this was actually the next day, even in Delhi, second-hand papers were selling for much more than the cover price. People were so horrified. This was the first time that people actually came to know that there is a famine in any part of India. But even after that, uh, John Herbert, who was the king's representative in Bengal, he was writing that all of this, it is very unuseful what the press was writing. Unhelpful tales of horror in the press. He said the viceroy. He wrote to the viceroy, who was Lord Linlithgow at that time. He says that the Bengal government could claim to have made good progress with its plans and organizations. So you see that it is possible for the administration to completely be in denial of facts that are happening out there. And today, when information has become so ubiquitous, when it is much more difficult to suppress news, you cannot perhaps deny it, decline it altogether. But what you find is that there is a tendency to underplay the seriousness of outbreaks of disease. And this is something that we as media persons, as journalists, see constantly. So even with the COVID-19 outbreak, there were many questions all over India in the press on whether there have been, enough protection for health workers and for hospital workers and doctors, whether there were enough tests for how much tests do we need? How much tests are actually being conducted? Why don't we have enough capacity for tests? What about the number of beds? Do we have adequate beds? What kind of beds have to be kept aside? What about non COVID patients? What about the huge amount of other kinds of health services? How are we going to keep them intact? And all these questions, even while they were rising, they were a large part of them by various state governments across the country were either being avoided or being outrightly, we were told that these are not important questions. And a lot of time there were accusations of the media whipping up a public frenzy, creating panic and asking irrelevant questions. Now, this is not the first time in Bengal, but particularly, this is not the first time that we see that there has been, I mean, and this is actually happening in various levels. It's not just that it's happening with this with the states, it's also happening between the state and the center. So when Kerala and West Bengal are saying that we are seeing community transmission happening in our states, the center state away denies that there is any kind of community transmission. On what basis? When health is a state subject primarily, then on what basis can the center say that we are not having community transmissions? And this has happened time and again with all outbreaks of epidemics. We all know that in Bengal we have had several very bad spells of dengue epidemics, right? Dengue almost reaches epidemic proportions just after the monsoon. We are heading for another dengue season right now. And every time we know that there is a great reluctance on part of West Bengal administration in admitting the actual number of the dengue patients. And we know that there was a phase when we had all these unknown fevers, right? Patients dying of unknown fevers, which subsequently we have found that there is less reluctance. But this could happen only because there was a lot of outcry on media. And this, a lot of media persons, a lot of media organizations had to take up, just like Jan Stephens at the time of the famine of 1943. Today also, we do it at great risk. And COVID has increased the risk many times, many fold. 186 journalists have died of COVID internationally, all over the world. And this, we all know, is a fraction of the true picture because many deaths do not get reported as deaths of a journalist, they are just counted as deaths of citizens. So, that itself is a huge problem. On top of that, because of the extremely bad economy, there has been huge retrenchments. Entire editions have been shut off, and entire desks have been fired. It is said by one estimate that more than 1,000 journalists have lost their jobs in the last few 3-4 months. And there are actually public litigations that are public interest litigations that are going on saying that journalists cannot be, just let go without benefits. Now, the question here is not whether journalists should have jobs or not. There's job loss everywhere, so why not journalists? The question here is very crucial. See, just as the statesman photo spread made the Bengal famine a reality. It identified a crisis as a famine. It flagged that issue. It, in a sense, made the Bengal famine a reality. So, also, epidemics, when they happen, they have to be identified and brought to the fore, and articulated as such. it is here that I would like to bring up another very important thing which was said by Amartya Sen in context of the China famine of 1959 to 61. That why free media is so important. He was saying that information blackout in China, information blackout was so complete with censorship and control of the state that the state's censorship and control over media was so complete, over any information given out by the media was so complete, that the government itself came to be deceived by its own propaganda and believed that the country had 100 million more metric tons of rice than it actually had. So, free press is extremely crucial to bring any kind of large scale public disaster, whether it's a famine or whether it's an epidemic, to the fore, and to press it, to push it as a public crisis which needs immediate attention, total attention. Because administrations always see these things as their failures, as political risks, and they tend to ignore them, to undermine them. But as citizens, we cannot take those risks. So, the value of free media is not just the question of freedom of speech for the journalists. It's the question of freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of expression, freedom to articulate at the risk to the entire community. So, my friends, I know that many of you, I find in the Facebook and in social media, many people say, if you want to stay sane, if you want to retain some kind of sanity and peace, don't look at news, don't look at TV, don't read newspapers. You just, sort of switch off from all those and just listen to music. Wonderful, listen to music. Next time when the epidemic hits you, you won't even know that it was an epidemic. Thank you. Thank you, I've finished.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharjee, for an extremely interesting, illuminating, and analytical presentation, which has enriched our knowledge of not only the pandemic, but also the power equations in our society. So now the time for question and answer session, and over to Dr. Amrita Bagchi.
Good evening, everybody, especially the speakers, for their mind-blowing presentations, both Shobhu Sachida and Dr. Shati Bhattacharjee. Excellent presentation, both of you. Thanks on behalf of the Department of History. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. As far as I have received the question, my first question is to Dr. Chattopadhyay, that since you are talking about past pandemic, the history of the pandemic in a historical sense, now one has asked you that do you think that history will repeat in this pandemic situation? Since we always say that history repeats itself, taking this into consideration, do you think that history repeat? Will there be any repetition of this pandemic situation in the coming age?
May I try to respond?
Yes, Shobhajita, yes.
Now, we always say that history repeats itself, but that does not mean the things will happen exactly what was happened in earlier period. Repetition is not held in a cyclic way, but in a spiral way. If it is cyclic way, then after the whole movement, one has to come to the starting point once again. The starting point and the ending point would be the same. But in spiral movement, we find the circle ends in a forwarding mode. Now, if you may think of a spiral binding or spiral book, then you can realize that history teaches us how to move one step forward uh, by knowing the past, and uh, thus we can rectify our past mistakes, which is also as we mentioned by Shati Bhattacharya, that the 1943 famine, the role of state. Now we may rectify those mistakes in the uh, future and in the present situation. That is the, I think, the teaching of history, and we can learn from that particular history. Oh,
Okay.
is there any question?
My next question is to Dr. Bhattacharya. One is asking about what do you think about the reasons or the causes behind the growth of COVID cases in India? Though you have explained in a very lucid manner the urban scenario, uh, and shall I place the second question, ma'am, or you will
Yeah,
answer
could you
separately?
repeat the question, please?
Yeah, the question is, what do you think about the what are the causes, or what do you think why COVID cases are increasing in India? The reasons or causes behind the growth of COVID cases in India.
Oh, well, see, one is that it was expected to increase. July and August was, epidemiologists have always said, had always said that the curve that we have seen in other countries, the same curve, if India has to go through, then the maximum cases will happen in July and August. So that probability was always there. We are just seeing that painful phase right now. Even saying that, perhaps there were steps that could have been taken to mitigate the number of infections. But many of those have not been taken, or certainly they have not been taken uniformly. So, across the states, we find many important differences. One difference is the number of tests. So, Delhi is having 46,000 tests per day, and West Bengal is having some 15 to 16,000 tests now. It used to have much less. It's trying to jack it up. The CM has promised that soon we will be having 25,000 tests. But even that, compared to a population, per lakh population, the number of tests is very less. Uh, whether this is an important indicator, important reason for spreading of the disease, there is some debate on that. But there are questions of how well we have followed the social distancing, mask wearing, and other kinds of things which could, preventive measures. Those are also factors. So there are questions of what the administration could have done. There are questions of what responsible citizens could have done, which might have mitigated. A slightly different question is the number of deaths, because it is more or less agreed that infections cannot be completely controlled, but number of deaths, the death rate can be successfully controlled if we are prepared enough. So that is one area where, from the point of public health policy, we need to constantly ask ourselves that whether our government has done enough in controlling deaths, and if not, then what are the sort of policy choices that they had, and whether the more articulate sections of the society, that is to say, frankly, the middle class, whether they had not skewed the choices against the poor. These are difficult questions, but these questions have to be asked.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question from the gender perspective, that is, women are more vulnerable to get infected than men because they are less protected than men. Mm. So, what is your opinion in this field? Women are more vulnerable to this disease.
Um, uh, well, if you look at the evidence, if you look at the evidence we have from the rest of the world and also India, then actually women are slightly better off in terms of infection. It is either 50-50 or 60-40. So more men tend to get infected, perhaps because they go out more, or perhaps because women generally, genetically, they have a little better immunity. But contrary to the rest of the world, in the Indian subcontinent, particularly Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, death rates were initially much higher for women. So the number of women dying from COVID as a proportion of number of women who had been infected, that was actually for some time higher than those of men. And this was probably because there is generally a tendency on part of family and society to ensure the welfare of the woman. Women's health is not given a lot of priority. So she is taken to the hospital, she is taken for testing, taken for treatment much later. And for COVID, that can be fatal. Right now, I think the death rates are more or less the same for both genders. But I'm glad you asked that question because COVID has thrown up many important questions of gender discrimination, but that perhaps is a topic of another discussion.
Thank you, ma'am. And another one is this to Shakidi. How much of the total report a journalist can candidly express in his or her writing during the pandemic?
It depends on the journalist, it depends on the organization, it depends on a lot of, it depends also on the state government, the ruling dispensation, how much criticism they are willing to take. So it varies. For one of the once again highlighting the importance of free press, I could say that, see, Kerala is usually acknowledged universally all over the world. It is acknowledged as one of the states which has most successfully dealt with the pandemic. And I think it is not a coincidence that media in Kerala is actually one of the strongest. And this happens because Kerala has actually a very strong science movement in its civil society.
Yes.
So they don't care what the government says. They will always come out and issue their own observations, their own data, their own studies on the situation of public health. This has happened over and over again. It happened during the Nipah outbreak, and again, it's happening in the COVID outbreak. And the press, of course, has that advantage of having these alternative figures that they can also publish and report. And is it a coincidence that the government there is much more active and much more responsive to the needs of the people? Perhaps not. It's not just one good health minister, it's also the civil society, it's also the press. So, the need for good press, the need for the journalist to be able to say what he or she has to say and to say it without fear, knowing that she might be wrong, but won't be slapped with a case of defamation if she does, if she makes an honest mistake. That is very important. But right now, what we see is that a journalist writes against on any kind of shortcoming on the part of the state in dealing with an epidemic, and he or she can be slapped with a case of defamation or for inciting trouble or even sedition. So this is not the way of historically. Actually, this is the first time that this is happening. Uh, no government has had a good relationship with the press. But the kind of intolerance
Yes.
that we see today, I would like to invite you, historians, to examine whether we have ever seen it in the history of this country, of a free India.
Uh, One is asking about can India develop the hard immunity to prevent COVID-19? Is it possible for a country like India?
So this is a question that really an expert should be should be answering. But I think that many of the experts that we have interviewed, whose interview we have carried in papers and in TV reports, they say that they're hopeful that herd immunity will happen, and that this many of them think, in fact, that this is the only way, because how many people can you vaccinate, and
Yes.
how much time will it take for the vaccine to come to be available, I mean to be manufactured and be available to a national program. It's huge money and a lot of time, so we are really hoping for herd immunity.
Now, at the same time, there is not enough healthcare infrastructure to provide uh, support or uh, health care to the infected population also, because India is always lacking in this field. Right.
Absolutely. Very true. Very true. Especially our primary health centers. You know, the first contact of the people, especially rural citizens, with healthcare is supposed to be the primary health centers. And these have been criminally neglected.
Yes, ma'am.
One of the reasons why Kerala is doing better is that their primary health infrastructure is better. So, yeah, we need to do a lot more to have our district and village level health care. It has to be much, much better. And we have to ask actually why we are spending so much money on
Yes, ma'am.
health insurance when our
Yes, ma'am.
primary health service is lacking.
Absolutely. Ma'am, another one is do you think that online journalism will receive a boost in this crisis time of the outbreak of pandemic?
Yeah, I hope so. Online, in any case, looks like the future of journalism. But but on the other hand, it is also true that uh, books, at least, we see that there has been no great decline in publishing of books. But you know, now as a working journalist, I'll tell you something, that we do not worry so much about what platform our reports and our articles get published in. In any case, everybody reads in mobiles or on Facebook or WhatsApp links, and some also prefer it in print. But as the New York Times says, that you have to subscribe it whether you're reading it in the paper or you're reading it on online. To them it doesn't matter. So us, for good journalism, it doesn't matter whether it's online, but it matters. Why does it matter? Because a lot of people in India still don't have access to the internet. So that is
Yes.
something that we need to worry about. We
Another
really
one question,
need to
Shadi.
be read.
Yes. Only 9% or something more than within 10, I
Yes.
guess. The population receiving the internet facility.
Internet as such, yes.
Yes. Another one question to you is what role should media play to protect the mental health during the outbreak of this pandemic? The protection of the mental health.
Well, we could bring you the advice of experts, I guess, who may give some guidance on what it is, what are the best practices for better mental health. See, I will not deny that because the conditions are so horrific, so stressful out there, the news that we report will be stressful to a lot of people. There is not
Yes.
much to be hopeful about. There is not much of the fun and frolic that we always see. So I think that we need to, it's not what media can do, it is more than that what everyone, each of us have to equip ourselves for mental health. One thing that media could do, and we are trying to do it with our journalism, is to make mental health a part of public health, which right now it is not. It's not regarded as a public health issue. It's a health issue, but not a public health issue. But recognizing mental health as a public health issue brings a certain amount of emphasis and certainly more funds to mental health. So, yes, that is something that media can usefully do.
Ma'am, another one is do you think that media creating a hype among the common people in the name of cautioning, uh, creating a kind of
No, yeah, that question is something that we are often asked, and sometimes we ask ourselves whether we are not, creating panic, whether we are not overreacting. But no, everywhere, wherever I have, I mean, in all countries, even when we look at international media, when we listen to the experts, when we listen to WHO and to the UN organizations and to UNICEF, I get the sense that this is a very serious epidemic and nothing that we say is enough. So it's really the other way. I think that media should try to do much more, of course, in a more meaningful way, not unnecessarily repeating itself. We have to do it more intelligently and more usefully. But no, we are not to caution you. I mean, in this case, no caution is too much caution. Really, this is a very serious thing and it has to be taken with utmost seriousness. Nothing is too much. For COVID-19 pandemic, nothing is too much. We have to be extremely cautious.
okay, ma'am. Thank you, Shakti. And I have one question to you. Do you think that the right to healthcare is challenged? I mean, the right to not only to COVID patients but to patients suffering from other diseases.
Yes,
The
of course. Yes, it's
right to
challenged.
health.
Right to health, right to food, right to nutrition, everything is right to education, everything is extremely challenged at the moment. But right to healthcare, let us just say, let's not even speak of rights because we have the Disaster Management Act, which sort of gives the government a kind of a leeway to ignore rights for the moment. But for example, right of free movement, that is a right that we have right now. It's severely curtailed because we have the Disaster Management Act in place. But let us look only at the possibility of health care. And there are major deprivations that we see. And one particularly I would like to highlight is that after the Ebola epidemic, we had found that more women had died by giving birth, while giving birth at home. That is to say, through by unsafe deliveries. that had killed many, many more women than the Ebola infection itself. And I very much fear that in India, we are standing at the door of such a horrible possibility. Because already the number of deliveries in hospitals has gone down compared to
Yes.
the last 3 months, last year's, the same 3 months, March, April, May. If we look, or no, April, May, June, compared to this year's April, May, June, the number of institutional deliveries has gone down significantly. So these women are probably giving birth somewhere in some condition. We don't know how. So there is very likely to be greater morbidity, greater mortality. Also, there is right now a huge uh, lack of contraception. So there has
Yes.
been, yes, so many more unwanted pregnancies. So all of this, unless the state wakes up to the fact that it is not just COVID that they are dealing with, they are dealing with many other life threatening situations. We are going to have a very skewed kind of health scenario in the coming months, coming years. And you know what happened? People are not having their diabetes medicine. They're not having their blood pressure medicine. Sometimes it's a supply problem. Sometimes it's an entitlement problem. They don't have the money. They're cutting down on medicines. So the load of untreated disease is going to increase exponentially, and that will cause real stress on the finances of the state. So it will be much better if we invest more to prevent these kinds of morbidities. We really have to think much more actively. We cannot go by patterns, we cannot go by designs, and above all, this is my last point, that above all, we cannot afford politics to remain an unending game of one upmanship and a game of blaming
Yes.
each other. Politics has to be useful, it has to deliver, it has to be responsive to its own citizens. The At the center of all our policies has to be the citizen, whose needs, whose aspirations have to be the priority. It cannot be the concern of defeating each other. And we, the citizens, as media, as academics, as researchers, as students involved in student movements, we have to make, we have to bring the citizen at the center of all our politics and our policy making. That is a very big challenge, but I think history shows us the consequences of not meeting that challenge, of ignoring that challenge, of caring more for small, selfish things. This is a very big crisis. There is no time to care
Absolutely.
for small self interests. No one is safe.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Now, my Shubhakshita, do you think that this outbreak of pandemic has an impact on environment? And
I have seen a number of questions in the chat box. So I would like to respond
yes,
all the
yes,
questions
yes,
uh, unitedly.
collectively.
Uh, So I think that one has asked that how can we learn from the present pandemic situation, how the historians respond to the present situation. Now, I think we can learn a lot from the contemporary history of the last 5 or 6 months. We have seen the what role had been played by the government, both union government and the government of West Bengal. And here, Shatiti has mentioned the role played by the government of Kerala, and she has mentioned the uh, role played by the science movement in Kerala. Now, I personally uh, tracing the history of science movement in West Bengal. Here we have seen that the political party mainly tried to capture the potentiality of science movements in their own. That was a big problem in the development of science movement in our state. Now, coming to the present pandemic situation, we have seen that how the working people were ill-treated from the very beginning of lockdown, and they had to face economic problems, social problems, and we have seen a lot of pictures of the migrant laborers who had to shift from their place of work to the place of residence, original residence. But they had to face a huge difficulty. And here the government did not play a positive role. The lockdown was imposed without considering the interest of those working class people. So that kind of things we had to point out while tracing the history of the present situation. Along with that, various rights had been curtailed in the present situation. Someone has asked that is it utopian to say on the right to health? I don't think so. But our emphasis, the emphasis of the state, is on the health care and the health insurance, as Chatterjee has mentioned. The state, both Union State and the government of West Bengal, is emphasizing on the Ayushman Bharat, Swasthya Sati, etc. for healthcare, but they are ignoring the uh, development of public health. And if we uh, study history, in 1946-48, the Board Committee worked and they recommended that the public health should be developed. And in 1983, when the first health policy uh, was uh, recognized, was announced by the government of India, it was said that health, public health should be focused. But in reality, what we find, because after the 1991 LPG, that is liberalization, privatization, globalization, as Amrita has herself worked on this situation, on this history, that the state is mainly focusing on healthcare, health insurance. So the whole health uh, scenario has been captured by the private enterprises. Thus, we lack the basic infrastructure in the primary health center and for healthcare, and we are not paying enough attention to the development of public health, which is the need of the hour. And this situation taught us that how it is necessary to develop proper public health. The Kerala model, which is an instance of the proper developed public healthcare system, and also the proper public health scenario that has been developed in Kerala, uh, that it worked in this situation. So I think it is the duty of the historians and the scholars to focus on these aspects rather than focus only on healthcare or health insurance. The present situation also taught us the role, what role can be played by the common people. If we see uh, the various relief program, the various rehabilitation program after the Amphan, along with the uh, pandemic situation, a number of persons uh, of various political lines, social lines, they uh, they done a commendable work for the betterment of common people, which was the duty of the state, duty of a welfare state. But the state lacked, and the common people, the civil society took the initiative. That is also a positive side of the present situation. I think I responded all the queries which have been asked by the honorable listeners. Am I? Is there any other question, Amrita?
Yes. Yes, you have almost answered all. I have one question to Shati Di, my last question.
Okay.
Yes, Shati, do you think that the private healthcare sectors are mainly profiting a lot from this outbreak of this pandemic? In fact, if we look into the case of West Bengal and if we see the rates which they are taking for the patients who are admitted, for the COVID patients especially. And the one thing is which is striking, there is no proper medicine to this. Apart from this, they are taking so much money, they're extracting so much money, and thus a business is a very in a crudest form a business is taking place. How far do you agree with it?
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to agree with this. And I was just thinking, how does one place this in the history of private healthcare? Perhaps Professor Chattopadhyay will have a greater insight into that. But if you look at the last 20 years, there has been a steady growth in the private healthcare sector in India, so much so that we now have more beds in private sector. And at the beginning of this epidemic, we found that 70% of the available ventilators were in the private sector. And ICU beds also, the vast majority of the ICU beds were in the private sector. Despite that, it is a reality today across the country that it is mainly the public sector, the government hospitals, which are handling the uh, COVID cases. The private hospitals almost everywhere, once again, perhaps Kerala is an exception, but other than that, they have practically shut their doors. They have refused to admit, first, they refused to admit COVID patients. Then, at a lot of places, the Disaster Management Act had to be evoked to bring their uh, beds and their human resources into the public sector under the control of the district magistrate. And so the government was forced to sort of force the private sector to forced to remind the public sector that it has the private sector that it has a duty towards the citizens and it cannot just shut shop. Almost every state, very recently, the latest perhaps is West Bengal, every state has capped the bed charge and the charge for testing for private
Yes.
hospitals. So why were they forced to do so? Because the charges were exorbitant. But despite that, of course, we find that they are resorting, many private hospitals are resorting to
But
uh,
in West Bengal, there is
Yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot hear you very clearly, but what I get what you are saying, and that is correct, that they are resorting to various, I would say not illegal perhaps, but unexpected, perhaps a little immoral, unhelpful ways,
actually
such as
government has
demanding a
don't have
cash
any
deposit. Why do you need a cash deposit? If you don't need it for others, then why do you need a cash deposit for an insured patient? Why do you need to charge for 20 PPEs when you're giving only one to the doctor? And remember that it's not just to the customer, to the consumer that they are being unfair. Many private hospitals are also being very unfair to the doctors because they are forcing them to work much beyond 6 hours in the same soiled PPE. And hence, they are increasing their chances of exposure, of contracting the virus. Over 100 doctors have already died of COVID in India. And this is an estimate by the Indian Medical Association. And, you know, this shows that we have an institutional weakness in control over the private hospitals. Even in the best of times, there had been huge disputes over charges, and now you're right, I would agree with you, Amrita, that there seems to be a certain amount of profiteering. We really hope that that were not the case, but what we are seeing in media indicate that certain allegations, certain accusations that have been made by citizens against the private hospitals may not be altogether untrue.
And the government doesn't have any control or regulation upon these private bodies, right? At least
It
in
has
case of West Bengal.
uh, uh, does it does it have technically yes, legally yes, and particularly right now they have see the autonomous bodies of medical persons, like what we used to have the MCI, now the various committees that the government has created, all of them have every right to investigate, to challenge, to force them to mend their ways, uh, to fix their charges, to toe the line. They have everything. Technically, we have everything. And right now, in the COVID situation, there's a Disaster Management Act. So if the government says, even a DM, it doesn't even have to be the state government, a district magistrate can send out an order and say that I'm taking over all your beds. And there's nothing that the private hospitals or nursing homes can do. They have to comply. This has happened in Ernakulam, in Kerala, and in a few other states also. They have taken over the beds. The question is of political will. Will the government do so? Can the government, does the government think it is too risky? Which is the greater risk of citizens
Okay.
not getting admitted, not getting a fair price, not getting a fair deal, endangering lives, or প্রাইভেট হাসপাতালে মালিকদের চটিয়ে দেওয়া? কোনটা বেশি risky? Which is a greater risk? Should I alienate the private hospitals, or should I um, just ignore people's plight? So this is the kind of choice that I have been talking about all throughout this presentation today, that this is where history becomes important, that it shows us the consequences of bad choice. And you, as professional historians, and we, as media people, we have to constantly highlight to the government and to the people what can be the consequences of wrong choice, bad choice, prejudiced choice. That is our job.
Right. Thank you, Shatidi. Thanks a lot. We had a wonderful question answer session, and now I would like to ask Anushwadi to put an end to this webinar by delivering the vote of thanks.
So at the beginning of my speech, I want to share on the behalf of my department the feelings of gratitude and thanks to the speakers of today's webinar. Sorry. Let us all give them a big round of applause. Now, we are especially thankful to our principal, Dr. Krishna Roy, for facilitating today's webinar. In addition, we are thankful to the IQAC coordinator, Dr. Kamul Kanti Shom, for all his cooperation. Thanks to all the students of my college, along with the students and colleagues who have joined in from other colleges. Our special thanks go to Mr. Akash Mondal for his technical support, without which the webinar couldn't be a success. Thanks to all my departmental colleagues, Amrita Bagchi for coordination, Nivedita Chakraborty for showing her artistic acumen in designing the webinar's flyer, Chirantani Das and Ishani Chaudhuri for their invaluable backroom support. So at the end of the session, let us all begin with a fresh approach and journey to counter COVID-19. So from the bottom of my heart, I wish all of you for a better future. Thank you.